Okay, so away we go. I think this is the third or fourth year that we've done this looking back and planning ahead, and it's things do change every year. There's some other things that we learn, and I think that's the wonderful part about working in our industry is that as soon as you think you know it, something else comes along and makes you change your mind. Oh gosh, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, chaps. So, what was 2018? Well, last year I put up 2017, which was the curate's egg, which is a very famous cartoon in the Punch from 130 years ago, which it makes a kind statement about things that are good in places, but that also means that things weren't so good in other places. And great thank you to Western Australia for putting their hand up and contributing significantly in the grain production area. The figures down the bottom of the table are the last 4 years of grain production, and the figures in red are the change from 2017 to 18, and basically Australia's down about 23%, down to about 29 million tonnes. So that's a big drop. Sorry, 23% down, 29 million tonne, and everyone's down quite significantly, other than Western Australia. And Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland are all down by at least half. So that's a big whack of grain that we hope we can grow some more next year. So part of the reason, of course, is the drought, and it's always interesting to look at these rainfall maps. This is March to November last year, but it's also probably just even more informative to look at the maps divided into the 3-month periods of leading up into winter and then into the spring and into the end of spring. And I think those late spring rains and the winter rains helped WA through. Unfortunately, they didn't quite make it to the eastern states, particularly New South Wales, and as a consequence, a lot of New South Wales was really in serious drought, severe deficiency, and the grain production figures reflect that. It was interesting, as a bit of a Twitter follower, I did see a harvest score put up by Adrian Goonan about how the farms in the Warrakirri group performed, and southern Queensland was a pass in the winter, but hopeful in the summer, and I think that's a bit like the Essendon Football Club. It always does well up until the start of the season. Northern New South Wales could do much better. Chickpeas were good. They had a good pass. Maybe that's a bit like the Freo Dockers. Could always do a lot better. Southern New South Wales, they certainly have been a star performer, but again, like my report card at school, they could also do much better. And Footscray, Western Bulldogs springs to mind. Victoria, well, we had a poor start and then it tailed off, and Carlton had the same season. The high rainfall zone's still batting along, and that'll finish top 4 certainly. South Australia, lower EP is very good. Other areas put in a shocker, like the Crows, and August will determine who makes the finals. August determined who made the finals, exactly the same as Port Adelaide, who didn't make the finals because of the poor August. Western Australia, cereals got an A, canola and pulses B+. And there's some looking for improvement in the future, and the Melbourne Football Club's always boasting that it's improving. But it was southern Western Australia that came up on top, like the Eagles, and Tassie's still going. It should finish in the top 4, even though it's in a not producing a lot of grain. So that's the good, the bad, and the ugly over the country. And I think we don't want to spend too much time looking back about what was done, because if we spend too much time looking back, we don't look forward quite enough. And so we do need to look forward, and we need to learn from the past about what we did and what we found out. Every year is different. 2018 is different to 17. 2019 will be different again. I'm not sure if anybody really knows what it'll be like. If they do, they probably make a lot of money somewhere. But so when we think about those looking forward in terms of nutrient management, nutrient management is only one part of the system, of course. And we divide it up into strategic and tactical. And strategic is the things you do maybe at the start of the season, planned at the start of the season, implemented at the start of the season. And we often think about strategic management for nutrients that don't have many other options for interventions. We might look at them with long-term objectives. The tactical ones are the nutrient interventions where they can be effectively implemented. We'd still plan them. We would have a strategic plan about what we'd do, but those tactics would be applied during the season. And the nutrients, obviously it's seeding. We've got seeding N, we've got phosphorus, potassium, zinc and copper as being the strategic ones. And there's some of the things that I would try and focus on today, the issues around the strategic decisions we made based on last year. I think that one of the most critical issues is it's going to be a paddock by paddock decision about what we can do. And it seems that there's an almost, to us as scientists, an amazing resistance to soil testing. You don't have to soil test every paddock, but certainly if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you are, you won't know where you're going. And it's a bit of Where's Wally with soil testing. You've got to know where your starting point is, and you need to make that assessment through a soil test. I'll just make 2 points about soil tests and soil sampling in particular. And these are probably the 2 touch points I always make about soil testing. Firstly, where do you go? Do you go between the rows, or do you go within the rows? Well, the opportunity for getting high values, this is some very nice work that came out of Western Australia. The opportunity, the chance to get very high values for sampling in the rows, simply because you pick up a granule or two. If you go halfway between the rows and half within the rows, you also might get a granule or two, and that shows up in the soil analysis. Between the rows, you may in fact have a artificially low value, and if you do the random samples, well, you can end up with more representative, but maybe a little bit mightn't actually reflect what the status was. These three lines on the graph, this is the phosphorus rate along the bottom applied in the previous year, and the phosphorus was either banded or drilled, deep banded, drilled, or drilled and then worked in. So the thing about whatever you do, try and not take samples just over the rows. The other thing about sampling is sampling to the correct depth, and FertCare has just released or releasing a very nice set of fertilizer sampling guidelines, and one of the diagrams that came out of that is to make sure that you take the sample to the correct depth. Soil tests are calibrated to a depth, particularly immobile nutrients like phosphorus. If you take 10 millimeters, if it's a 0 to 10 centimeter, and you don't take the last centimeter, that might be a 10% higher soil test, because you haven't taken the lower soil, which is where the less nutrients are. And this is the soil test actually calibrated to the 0 to 10. If you go deeper, you might get a 10% lower soil test. If you kick away the dirt at the top, where there's a lot of phosphorus, you may end up with 20 to 30%. If the core breaks and you end up with only the top part of the core, that soil test might come back nearly twice what the actual value would be. So sample to the correct depth, I think, and try and do a representative sample within and between rows. A couple of issues that I just wanted to touch on from 2018. One was about dry sowing and fertilizer damage. We did see a bit of that with the dry start to the season. A lot of crops were either sown dry or sown on marginal moisture. That's a combination of the crop type, soil water, soil texture, the machinery being used and the fertilizer being used. And the basic rule is if you're going to put nitrogen in, don't put any nitrogen with canola, simply because in the drill row with canola, certainly you can use twin shooting, you can use other options, but using trying to put a lot of any amount of nitrogen down the row with $40 a kilo canola seed seems to be a questionable decision. There is a link to a website up the top where you can put in some of those different configurations, and it'll give you a suggestion as to a safe rate for the particular situation. Of course, those rates are conservative, and people will say, oh yes, I've got away with such and such. Well, you might very well, but in terms of making a recommendation, getting away with it isn't a good way to make a recommendation. So that's just a reminder for this coming season, because the nitrogen issue is also mentioned by a few people, nitrogen placement and timing. A lot of nitrogen efficiency is about minimizing losses, and in a lot of areas we had dryish conditions, so there was little denitrification, that also little leaching, and there may have been some significant immobilization simply because there were big stubbles generally, and there's also and those three factors probably contributed to. The first two were bonuses, and the third one was a bit of a drag, but some of that nitrogen comes back. So our nitrogen status, was pretty well managed because we didn't have many significant loss processes operating. We also talk about volatilization of surface applied urea and ammonium sulfate. People are very concerned about how much nitrogen is lost. This little graph to the right here is from some work done in New South Wales, by Graham Schwenke, looking at different different fertilizers, urea, UAN, green urea, ammonium sulfate, applied into different situations such as on wheat, on fallow, and the red line represents 10% loss of urea, of nitrogen from those different ureas. And you can see putting it on fallows, 25% loss, putting it on urea on pasture is about the same. So those are the situations, but generally the losses with volatilization of ammonia from urea, from nitrogen fertilizers, tends to be very low. We often see that there's no response to applied nitrogen when it's dry, but that's because the nitrogen actually doesn't get down into the root zone. And very nice work from Victoria looked at in a year, that 2014, into 2015, where the nitrogen was in the carry through, and where there was 50 kilograms of urea or green urea top dressed in the prior season. In fact, 80% of that nitrogen was still in the topsoil, and in the top dressed urea, there was still about 60% in the top 10 and 20 centimetres. So that tells us that there is carryover from season to season of nitrogen, and it's not lost. sometimes the poor responses will mean that nitrogen's carried into the following season. Another interesting metric to think about is what was the grain protein. There's a lovely little graph done by Glenn McDonald in South Australia. And what he did, he took a lot of field work over the past 20 years almost, looking at nitrogen response and grain protein in wheat, and graphed it in terms of what was the grain protein response where there was no nitrogen, what was the grain protein where there was no nitrogen, and what was the sort of response to nitrogen if you did add more if you did add more fertilizer. So where crops at 8.5% protein, the sort of nitrogen response to nitrogen, kilograms of grain per kilogram of N, is about 30 kilograms of grain per kilogram of N, very responsive. If we move to where you're removing 11.5% protein, extra nitrogen doesn't give any benefit, wouldn't have given any benefit. So in terms of what we take away from that is that if your protein's 10, 10.5, 11.5, really the marginal, you haven't left much yield on the table. If your protein's less than 8.5, you have left significant amounts of yield behind. The responses are highly variable, of course, simply because of the nature of the experiments across many years and many regions, but the message is pretty clear. If you're 8.5, even up to 10%, you still have some extra nitrogen response that you could have gathered. And that sort of builds on a graphic I've shown many times, which is about protein and relative yield from some work in the US. And they said that basically at 12.5% and above, you were at maximum yield. 12.5% protein above, you're at maximum yield. If you're below, in their situation, if you're below 12.5 or 13%, you had not achieved your maximum yield. Proteins tended to be quite good this year, so that suggested that nitrogen management was also pretty good. So what about nitrogen for 2019? Well, the GRDC Agric Paddock Survey and the National Paddock Survey have shown that nitrogen is a key driver, and again, it'll always be a key driver in our systems, simply because we're relying more and more on bag nitrogen as we run down other sources of organic nitrogen. Legume influences from 2018 will be largely dependent on how well the legumes grew. A very nice figure from Michael Moody in the Mallee showing the relationship between fixed N and the net amount of nitrogen into net input of fixed N. So that's net means how much is fixed versus less the amount that has been removed in grain. And you can see there's quite a huge variation, but the bottom line in that is that 2 years of data, one clustered down here, one clustered up here, but generally, you know, somewhere between 25 and 100 kilograms of N contributed. And they also, that group also did some assessments of nitrogen at sowing after those various crops, and you know, the nitrogen, not mineral nitrogen after wheat was about 30 kilograms. As you started to include more legumes, lentils, veg, field pea, the amounts contributed, you know, were significantly higher. Oats, not so much. Oats, veg and medic. The oats probably used most of the nitrogen that was fixed. I think one of the other take-homes for me about nitrogen fixation in legumes is to make sure that they're well nodulated. The little picture down in the bottom right corner is taken from an experiment we had in the Western District of Victoria with faba bean. We had inoculated them, but the soil pH was 4.5, and none of the nodules actually survived. So in fact, these beans, although we talk about them as legumes, were net nitrogen users simply because they didn't have any fixed nitrogen contribution. So inoculation is a message going forward, and also checking the nodulation on your legumes as you go through the season. Well, taking forward from now into the summer, where are we going to be? Well, the thing that's going to happen is mineralization and nitrification, the conversion of organic nitrogen to ammonia, and then ammonium to nitrate. That process, low pH limits it, very low pH. Temperatures between 15 and 25, and when it's water, so when it's wet. So anytime there's nice, good conditions, such as when there's an early break, warm winters, extended springs, and also in our situation over the fallow period, over this summer fallow, will be the opportunity for mineralization when there's rain, and we've sort of got quite a big rain front coming through at the moment. How much mineralization? Well, it's always the always the perennial question, isn't it? John Angus suggested that where you've got about 1% organic carbon, which is about 0.1% total soil nitrogen, about 3% of that is mineralized per year. So that's 3 per millimetre of rain. So 3.3 kilograms of nitrogen mineralized per millimetre of summer rain. And if it's after a legume, then 0.5, so a bit higher because it's more labile. The organic materials have higher carbon to nitrogen ratios. So that suggests that with this summer rain and with maybe some carryovers, some of the starting nitrogens might be quite a bit different. But we need to consider that if it gets very wet, we'll have not just demobilisation, we'll also have denitrification if the paddocks get flooded. So that might reset it back. The other thing that is a critical management strategy is emphasised in this very nice work by Colin McMaster and Nerily Graham in New South Wales, just done just west of Forbes, I think, and it was some work looking at summer weed control and the carryover of water and nitrogen. And the red lines on that are where there's been no weed control. The dotted lines are where there's been, ordinary weed control, and the blue lines are where weed control has been good. And there's 2 years of data in this 2011 and 12, I think, and then to the mineral nitrogens corresponding to those waters. The story basically is where you had good weed control, the subsequent canola crop had an extra 0.8 tonnes per hectare, which on over the average of the 2 years was an extra 60 millimetres of water and an extra 55 kilograms of nitrogen. And that return for summer weed control was $77.20 for each dollar invested. So in terms of conserving that nitrogen from these summer rains, we need to get in and make sure that we've got very good weed control going forward. So with that in mind, what will we be thinking about? We may be going into a situation where we do have quite good soil mineral nitrogen status. The options that are pre-drill for the nitrogen, that tends to be low efficiency. We might not need that. Use low nitrogen fertilizer sources such as MAP or TSP in the drill row. That becomes a problem. We move nitrogen away from the seed, such as twin shooting, using machinery that's able to separate by a couple of centimetres, preferably to the side, not just above the seed or below the seed, because the seed will, if there's not good closing mechanisms after the seeding implement, the seed can just drop down into the fertilizer channel, or the fertilizer can drop down into the seed channel. Mid-row banding's also been discussed. Graham Sandrill's doing some lovely work on that in New South Wales. John Angus and myself did some work nearly 20 years ago on it in the Mallee, looking particularly at managing nitrogen on soils with subsoil limitations. And this little table down the bottom is from 14 experiments we had in the Mallee, looking at no nitrogen, nitrogen at sowing, mid-row banded nitrogen, which is every second row, or whether nitrogen was split, and the yields and the proteins for those. And we certainly saw very good recoveries and very good responses to 30 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen mid-row banding. This year we'll probably need to, we can probably have a minimal nitrogen at seeding. 30 kilograms is enough to get most crops through, and it may be that there's adequate mineral in to actually do that, and maybe with just a bit of pop-up, what we call pop-up N, would be adequate to get the crop through to our first set of nitrogen decisions, which will be about a bit like playing pontoon. You know, as your potential goes up or down, you decide whether you're going to buy, sell, or flip, or fold altogether on your nitrogen decisions. You know, what would you do on 17? Would you sit, buy, or flip? And a lot of us, I think, we're on 17 this year, and wondering whether we should fold or not. In fact, some of us think we're on 11, on 12, and wondering whether we should fold. That nitrogen budget is something that we can discuss again later, maybe later in the year. But it is something that we'll start to think about as the season moves forward, and we get a better feeling for water status. The other thing we also saw lots of in Victoria and a lot of areas was hay cutting. And in a general sense, we can think about hay as being another way to remove nutrients. It doesn't present any special extra issues, but it does remove a lot of nutrients. And here's some examples of some crop removals. Wheat at 60 kilograms of nitrogen, 3-ton wheat crop, 2-ton canola crop, 60 kilograms, barley, 3-ton, all about 60 kilograms. If we had have cut that wheat crop for hay, that would be about 100 kilograms of nitrogen removed. If the canola crop was cut for hay, it would be about 120. So the nitrogen's drawdowns from those situations can be quite high. Phosphorus is all pretty similar. Potassium becomes very high if it's an issue in your region when you cut hay, because it's almost a 10-fold increase in potassium removal with hay. And sulfur also becomes an issue. We've put some question marks against the sulfur contents. The data we have from many places is that the canola has about 0.8% sulfur during its later growth, and that equates to 8 kilograms per tonne of sulfur, 8 kilograms per tonne of biomass. So that's quite a lot of sulfur in that plant. Not a lot of it gets taken into the crop. So of that 30, if it was a 4-ton canola hay crop, it probably would give you about that 10 kilograms of sulfur in the grain. So that still means there's 32 in the residue. There is a lot of sulfur in crop residue, sulfur in canola residue. So when we think about what's going out the gate, a 3-ton wheat crop is removing somewhere around 50 kilograms of MAP and 100 kilograms of urea, 25 kilograms of MOP, muriate of potash. 6-ton hay crop, 50, 80, 180 and 240. You can see the huge potassium increase. And if it's a 1-ton crop, 15 kilograms of MAP, 40 kilograms of urea and 10 kilograms of MOP. So the removals obviously are scaled to the yields. We often think, are those numbers actually correct? Are they really what the removals are? We've done a few surveys, grain surveys, and also from experimental values. And the graph on the with the 3 lines on it is the sulfur in the red, the phosphorus concentration in the blue, and the potassium concentration in the green for wheat grain taken from a whole series of NVT sites around Australia. And what they tell us is that we might have a wheat phosphorus level for removal of 1.8 or 2.2 tonnes per hectare, 2 tonnes per tonne, but in fact that varies from 1.8 up to about 4.2. And similarly for potassium, it can be 3.3 up to about 6.5. So we have these numbers, but they are quite variable. This is an example taken from an Incitec Pivot long-term fertilizer experiment. And these are the phosphorus concentrations. These are actual measured phosphorus concentrations in the grain of canola, wheat, and oat and hay at 4 levels of phosphorus: 0, 9, 18, and 36. And they're the corresponding Colwell p-values when they were soil Colwell p-values when they were taken. And you can see, for example, in the canola, the phosphorus concentration went from 4.7 to 7.6, wheat 1.8 to 2.6, and the oat and hay went from 1.3 to 2.1. And when we say look at the P removal in that situation, it went from 4.7 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare to 17.4 kilograms per hectare. So phosphorus offtake varied fourfold depending on soil N and P status. Potassium threefold, nitrogen twofold, and sulfur twofold. So if we then look at, well, what's the error that would mean in terms of our budgets? This again is this is for potassium now in the same experiments over 0, 9, 18 P and some different nitrogen levels. That's the that's the concentration in the oat and hay. That's the removals in red, and for 8 for 0, 9, and 18. And they're the mean removals. If we estimated those mean removals, based on the average potassium concentration, the estimates would be between 20 and 40% less than the actuals. So, and if we looked at estimated P removals based on a standard P concentration, we think that would be somewhere between 40% lower and 25% higher than actual. So there are some inherent errors in those values, and of course they're just ballpark figures, but it does tell us we need to think about maybe getting some of those figures done for our own situations, particularly relating to different soil fertilities. So what's the likely scenarios going into 2019? Well, hay cut from good crops. This is some examples. I've just sort of thought through where would we be. Probably the lowest nitrogen status would be hay crops where there'd been a good hay crop. The only benefit that those paddocks have is that they'll have a bit of residual water. Where there's good yields, that water disappears because of the longer maturity of the crop, so potentially a lower status, lower than the hay cut. If you cut hay from poorer crops, the removal is similar to the good crop, but it's potentially a lower nutrient status than that. But there will be water. Harvested legumes, and maybe nitrogen surplus or nitrogen neutral. This is a big question about nitrogen fixation and carry through from harvested legumes. Some are nitrogen neutral. Things like faba beans tend to produce much more biomass and so fix much more nitrogen, and the nitrogen concentration in the seed is relatively low, so that means that often that fixed nitrogen remains as a surplus in the soil. Failed legumes could be potentially better status. Not that we'd ever aim to grow a failed legume crop. And poor yields have low removals, so potentially the higher nutrient status, and frosted legumes with no grain are potentially the highest status. So that sort of gives us an idea of the likely nitrogen status in those fields as we look forward to 2017. And how we manage summer weeds from now on is, of course, the big question and the big management strategy. So with those sorts of numbers for differential nutrient values, are we using nutrient budgets or fudgets? And that fudget concept, Chris Dowling from Back Paddock had that in one of his presentations. And it's okay to have a budget as long as we understand the assumptions that are there. On the nutrient supply side of the budget, we know the nutrient input. The soil supply or the potential response is estimated using a soil test. That's variable. If we don't do it, we don't know anything about the soil supply. So that's one big gap in your knowledge base. Nutrient removal side, yield is known. Nutrient concentration is estimated or measured. Estimation has some errors in it. We also don't very often include the losses of nutrients, and they can be estimated or guesstimated. And the residual nutrients are estimated or sometimes just ignored. And unfortunately, someone in one of the questions leading up asked me how can we work out how to get nitrogen right? And I don't think we'll ever get nitrogen completely right, simply because of the losses that are involved in so many processes around nitrogen. And all we can do is use the tools available, such as yield potentials and climate and sensors and shoot counts. And of course, something that I mention nearly every year is about enriched strips. And what they do, enriched strips across the fields, integrates all those processes of mineralization and denitrification and leaching and whatever else is going on in and outside a strip that has extra nitrogen. And so it gives us an idea of what the potential response to an extra 50 kilograms of nitrogen is. We might want to realise that, but at least we have some knowledge about what the potential response is. And one of the comments that Mark Branson used was that the strips give me confidence not to apply nitrogen, which is just as important because that saves money. And of course, good observation. So always being in and around looking at your crop, whether it's on foot or motorbikes or whatever, just trying to get a good feel for canola, for example. Really good sign is just that leaf, that bottom leaf going yellow and if it goes that yellow without any lesions on it, it's most likely to be a lack of nitrogen supply. So we go back to soil tests. A good soil test estimates soil phosphorus supply, for example. We have a value there. This soil test value is in the black line. We think somewhere between 90% and 100% of maximum yield is the economic optimum. And at 90% or 95% maximum yield, we would set a critical soil value for the soil test. And where it reaches 100% of yield potential, we would say that was the maintenance value. And so when we talk about the fertility, phosphorus fertility, we go from very low, moderate, high to very high in those situations. And the management strategies that are involved within those segments, this is pretty much common knowledge and common sense, is that if you're in a build phase, it's important to try and increase the soil test, and that will require some extra nutrients to address that increase. We'll also have removal of nutrients and losses and fixation. And when I mean fixation, the various loss processes that are associated in this case with phosphorus or fixation processes. When you're in a maintenance phase, the fertilizer strategy is about removal, what's being taken out, and then with losses, and then a little bit extra for losses and fixation. And if you're at the sufficiency stage, It's just losses and fixation. We'll come back to that graph in a moment, but that's the general strategy that we think of. Someone asked about what's the role of PBI when you do that budget. Well, PBI is almost an assessment of this fixation process. What are the losses associated with that with those soils? It's the P demand for the soil. We have to be careful defining what low and high are, because as we move across the nullarbor, the values for low become the values for high can still be quite low in our eastern state soil. So low PBI soils are at risk of leaching. High PBI soils have an additional P demand. PBI does affect coal P. The graph up in the right is one that was proposed out of Queensland as a relationship that you could actually estimate coal P status just with the PBI. That's not always been the case. We think that it's obviously it's a little more complicated than that. Higher, but theoretically a higher PBI should have a higher critical coal value, but there's not a lot of data to support that other than logic. Many high coal test values, if PBI in the eastern say is 200 or so, we consider that to be a high value. Critical values are not much affected, but of course there's always a but. We have to make sure we know where the critical value is sitting, and we now would prefer to talk about critical ranges. These are the sort of critical ranges for coal Ps for those different situations. A couple of points to make. Canola's less responsive than phosphorus to cereals, less responsive than cereals to phosphorus. Peas seem about the same responsiveness as wheat. Wheat after canola is more responsive to phosphorus. We've seen some data on that. And sowing time can also affect phosphorus status. So early sown crops tend to have better root growth and are able to access more soil phosphorus. So we can think about the need to invest more phosphorus in later sown crops or less in early sown crops. So that's the but. That's the situation. But the but is, where are we at the moment in terms of the critical coals? This is some data from the Nutrient Advantage Lab, and in southwest Victoria and central Victoria, there's really only 4 out of 5 paddocks that were tested had coal P values below, let's say, a critical 35, which means, 1 out of 5 paddocks had a coal P that was responsive, suggests responsive. 4 out of 5 had a coal P that was above, and in some cases very much above the coal P criticals. Not quite so dramatic in the north and northwest. Basically, 3 out of 5 paddocks were responsive, and that means 2 out of 5 are really at a level that's significantly high. So that what we need to consider there is where are we back on that response curve? Those values are also supported in some work I did looking at P rates or P balances across 500 paddocks in Victoria and southern New South Wales, and we looked at the removal and use of phosphorus in those situations. 15% of those paddocks were removing more phosphorus than was being supplied, but 85% were adding more phosphorus than was being removed. This is sort of after the Millennium Drought too, but certainly there's a lot of paddocks that are receiving more phosphorus than is being taken away in grain. And in fact, in this situation, 25% of those paddocks were receiving twice the phosphorus that was being removed. So if that's the situation, we maybe need to think that where we're at this part of the response curve, instead of adding more phosphorus and pushing that to the right, we should actually obviously try and reduce the soil test and draw down some of those soil reserves. So putting coal wool where it's maintenance, we use less than maintenance values to draw reserves down. We might be able to do much about the fixation and losses, but we can certainly try and draw some of the soil reserves out. And it's been shown quite unequivocally in pastures that operating at high soil test values provides no extra benefit. There's no benefit having a coal wool P of 80 when the critical value might be 25. It doesn't provide you any leeway. The only exception to that seems to be in very high yielding areas. We've seen some coal wool P responses in the high rainfall zone at wheat responses at coal wool Ps around the 40 to 50 milligrams per kilogram. So does depend a little bit on that, on what your yield potential is, and it's not just a relative yield. So if we're at that level, why would we just completely ignore phosphorus? Well, there is some significant importance about having fresh peat, particularly if you're later sowing. If you're early sowing, maybe you can get away with even lower phosphorus. But just an example from one of the previous droughts we ran through in 2006-7 over here, how much phosphorus was applied in 2006. We came back with sort of half rates in 2007. Really, there was no difference. At 5 kilograms was as good as 10 kilograms, and that was as good as a residual of 20 in the previous year. So there was a significant yield increase with the 5 kilograms of phosphorus applied, but really that was enough, and there was no extra benefit from having another 10. So we can reduce phosphorus rates, but think about making sure that there's phosphorus accessible early, and that comes down to the granule size in essence. A minimum of 3 to 5 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare. To supply 2 kilograms of phosphorus in 25 centimetre rows, we need granules 8 to 12. That ends up with granules about 8 to 12 centimetres apart. If we go any lower than that, the granules become so far apart that they won't be readily accessible to the crop. So that's why we set a minimum. We also nearly always see that benefit with seed row phosphorus. So if we're trying to cut back, what do we cut back on? Well, people would first stop is usually cutting back on legumes, attempting to reduce that. Little data on P responses. What we do know is that phosphorus does stimulate legume growth. Legume growth affects nitrogen fixation, and better biomass means more nitrogen fixed. And so cutting back on legumes, phosphorus on legumes, means you reduce the amount of nitrogen fixed, and so the expense of next year's nitrogen. If you're going to consider reducing anything, maybe consider dropping P rates back on canola, because that's less responsive. I think I just jumped over that last slide because it goes into a little economics, and I'll just go back to it and read the top line, which is don't overthink. Soil test estimates soil supply. It doesn't have economics in it. There is a need. We can't really answer an economic problem with a biophysical model, and so we need to put some economics in that. And that's really beyond the scope of this talk. That's a talk in its own right. The other thing to think about with phosphorus is, as we talked about nitrogen test strips, why not have an accidental phosphorus miss, turn the map off? And some farmers do that on purpose or by chance, and very often we see this effect. In the long term, getting nitrogen right is also important. Again, when we go back to that systems, the farming systems paddock survey that I talked about, if we looked at the nitrogen balances, 60% of the paddocks that we looked at were removing more nitrogen than being supplied. Six out of 10 farmers were miners, where the partial nutrient balance was greater than 1. And that included fixed N in that equation. That nitrogen that the miners are taking out is being derived from previous organic nitrogen sources, and that's why that's a consequence of that is that soil organic carbon, soil organic matters keeps declining, and the line that John Angus uses is that each generation soil organic carbon declines by about half. So we need to be aware of getting our nitrogen right. And the essence of putting those phosphorus and nitrogen balances together is to say maybe we should be taking some of our phosphorus fertilizer budget and putting it into nitrogen, or looking at including more legumes in the rotation. Those are two big ticket items that we could think about. Changing the farming system is a big challenge, though, obviously. I just wanted to finish on one final issue. There's a large number of new products coming on the market all the time in terms of emerging products related to agricultural fertilizers and also agricultural chemicals. There's things like acids, humic acids, and microbials, all different bugs. We know that rhizobia have been there for a long time. Trichoderma and mycorrhiza have been recognised. There's extracts such as seaweed and kelp, and also a whole range of other things such as minor elements like cobalt and so forth. Those products appear and become marketed something like the truth on Twitter. Twitter is a fantastic tool, but it's also has cause for a lot of sins too. The plant on the right has nothing. The plant on the left also has nothing. That was specifically put up on Twitter for that purpose, of showing that this is a sort of natural variation we can see, and putting a picture up on Twitter of some plots or some plants in August really doesn't cut it in terms of evidence about effectiveness. And I mean, we all do it. We all like to take pictures of our experimental trials or things we've seen and then draw a line from that, what we've seen, into a hypothesis without the evidence that backs it up, say, with yield. So what I'm trying to say here is that whatever you see on the internet might not always be true. And Abraham Lincoln was quoted as saying that. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but anyway, it was on the internet, so it must be true. So when we think about evaluating evidence that we might have on any of those products, and I'm not saying that they don't work or they do work, all I'm saying is we should be calling for evidence. And it should be science, not pseudoscience. Pseudoscience has got some characteristics about it that people are less able to change their views. The sort of evidence from trials are, I've got 7 R's there: referenced, with controls, replicated, randomised, repeatable, reasonable, reported, and refereed. Sometimes the trials are done quite well, but there might be 20 trials done and you only see the results from 2 of them. So that becomes an issue in terms of their repeatability. And also, is it reasonable? Is it true? Is it a reasonable thing that would happen? So test yourself. As a farmer, it's your money. As an advisor, it's your reputation. And as a business, it's your future. I know we might think we live in a post-truth era, but there's actually more and significant things that we need to address in that. And the question always, whether you're a farmer asking an advisor asking a supplier, how do you know that? Where's your evidence? and that's going to be more and more important. So look, in terms of a quick summary, nutrient strategies 2019, soil test for NP particularly, make sure the sampling is good. Nitrogen is likely to be variable, end fudge it as a starting point. Fixed nitrogen on failed legumes may be a bonus. Phosphorus at sowing is the only real option, banded placement near the seed row. Phosphorus rates can be reduced on failed crops and at high soil test values, but have some P at seeding. It's terrible to make forecasts about the future, but that's what I've done. And just to invite any questions, this is what Victoria, after its poor season, has been doing with its silos. At least make them look pretty, even if there's no grain in them. This is the silo art trail through the Wimmera Valley.